February 1943. The Atlas Mountains breathed a cold wind across the valley. Dawn had not yet broken, but the shadows were already moving. Long, stretched silhouettes of American soldiers who barely understood what waited beyond the ridgeline. Their boots sank in the loose sand as engines rumbled in the distance, a low metallic growl echoing through the pass. Kasserine was quiet, too quiet, and in that silence, an army still young in the ways of desert warfare prepared to meet an enemy who had crossed continents mastering it. On the other side of the valley, German reconnaissance units were already in motion, their optics scanning every slope, every pocket of terrain that could hide a machine gun nest. Under the command of Erwin Rommel, the veterans of the Afrika Korps knew exactly how this landscape behaved, how the light bounced off the dunes, how the dust revealed movement, and how the narrow pass could swallow a division whole if used correctly. They had fought this kind of war since 1941. For the Americans, Kasserine was their first real examination. The U.S. Army entered North Africa with confidence, strong industry, and fresh divisions. But confidence is not experience. And war in the desert required a language the Americans had not yet learned. Coordination between armor and infantry, rapid communication under fire, and the instinct to read terrain like a living map. At Kasserine, those weaknesses would no longer be academic. They would become visible, tangible, brutally exposed. In early February, the Allied front in Tunisia stretched thin, a patchwork of British, American, and French sectors. Intelligence reports underestimated the scale of the German movement toward the passes. Some commanders dismissed the idea of a full breakthrough attempt. Others believed the terrain itself would protect them. What no one fully realized was that Rommel intended to push directly through the American lines, to test their discipline, their cohesion, and their command structure in one decisive stroke. The 1st Armored Division and elements of the 2 Corps held positions around the Kasserine Pass, a natural corridor carved between mountain walls. For American planners, it seemed defensible. For the Germans, it looked like opportunity, a bottleneck in which an inexperienced army could be unbalanced before it even understood what was happening. The stage was set not for a battle of equals, but for a harsh lesson delivered under fire, in a place where every mistake carried consequences measured in lives and lost ground. As the sun finally rose over Kasserine, it did not illuminate a battlefield prepared for war. It revealed an army still finding its footing. And in that fragile moment, the first signs of the storm began to whisper through the valley. The first German probes reached the outskirts of the American lines just after sunrise. They came quietly at first, light armored cars, half-tracks, and reconnaissance motorcycles weaving through the folds of the terrain. Their objective was simple: test the American positions, draw fire, and map every response. In the desert, information was as valuable as ammunition. And the Germans gathered it with clinical precision. Across the pass, American units waited behind hastily prepared defenses. Many of them were dug into positions chosen more by convenience than by terrain logic. The ridgelines that should have hosted observation posts were underused. The overlapping fields of fire that doctrine demanded were irregular. Units were spread thin, often unable to see each other, and communications between battalions were far from seamless. The Americans had courage, plenty of it. What they lacked was a shared battlefield instinct. In Tunisia, that absence became painfully clear. By mid-morning, German artillery opened up. The first shells struck the slopes behind the American positions, deliberately bracketing the range. Seconds later, the barrage shifted forward, walking its way toward the pass with measured discipline. Dust clouds rose like pillars as shrapnel tore through the air. For many U.S. soldiers, this was their first exposure to a coordinated artillery preparation, and the sudden violence stunned entire platoons. Then came the tanks. German Panzer IVs, supported by the mobile and agile Panzer IIIs, appeared through the haze like dark silhouettes. Even at a distance, their movement carried a level of confidence that unsettled the defenders. The armored thrust hit the forward American elements before they could fully react. Some anti-tank guns were positioned too far back, others faced the wrong direction due to narrow firing arcs imposed by the terrain. When the first rounds were fired, several overshot their targets. The German gunners did not miss. The initial clash unfolded in minutes. American tanks, mostly M3 Lees and early model Shermans, attempted to reposition under pressure. But coordination broke down quickly. Orders crackled over radios with interference. Some units received instructions to hold, others were told to pull back. The result was confusion, a patchwork of movements that created gaps exactly where the Germans pressed hardest. Rommel's veterans exploited the uncertainty with ruthless efficiency. Their tactic was straightforward: identify the point where the American line wavered, concentrate fire, and push until the defenders fractured. In open desert, mobility meant survival, and the German armor maneuvered with the instinct of men who had fought for years across similar landscapes. For the Americans, the first hours of the battle revealed a brutal truth. Courage alone couldn't compensate for fragmented command and control. The II Corps was still adjusting to new leadership structures, new doctrines, and new theaters of war. The Germans weren't adjusting, they were executing. By afternoon, the fight at the mouth of the pass had become a contest of endurance. American units that held their ground did so with grit, improvisation, and raw determination. Others, overwhelmed by fire and pressure, began to fall back towards secondary positions deeper inside Kasserine. The valley was becoming a funnel, and the Germans were steadily tightening their grip. As the German armor pushed deeper into Kasserine, the valley began to work against the Americans in ways they hadn't fully anticipated. The narrow slopes that seemed like natural defensive walls now became channels of movement, perfect corridors for a force that understood how to combine speed and pressure. Panzer crews used every curve of the terrain to mask their approach, darting forward, firing, disappearing behind rock formations, and reappearing at new angles. Their movements weren't reckless, they were calculated, practiced, almost rhythmic. American infantry, positioned along the ridgelines and shallow trenches, watched the armored shapes maneuver with unsettling confidence. Many soldiers fired, repositioned, and fired again, often unsure whether their rounds were landing where they intended. Dust clouds kicked up with each shell impact, blinding observers and choking the air. Radio chatter filled the gaps, fragmented, tense, often contradictory. Pull back to phase line red. Hold your ground. Wait for armor support. Armor support delayed. The conflicting orders weren't signs of incompetence. They were signs of an army still learning how to fight a fluid, fast-moving adversary. Command posts were scattered, lines of communication were overloaded, and units rarely shared a unified picture of the battlefield. While German commanders rode close to the front, adjusting tactics in real time, many American officers received updates that were already outdated by the time they arrived. At midday, German infantry began advancing alongside their tanks, using a blend of suppressive fire and smoke grenades to close the distance. Their machine gunners moved with a deliberate purpose, shifting fire to pin American positions while assault groups worked their way through gullies and dry streambeds. The Americans responded with determination. Browning machine guns rattled, mortar crews snapped into action, and small pockets of resistance slowed the German pace. But each stand, no matter how courageous, faced the same challenge. They were fighting a force that specialized in breaking cohesion. American tank crews tried to counterattack. Shermans and Lees rolled forward, engines roaring, turrets scanning for targets. But many found themselves isolated, launching into engagements without sufficient infantry support or clear coordination. Some tankers fired at silhouettes barely visible through the dust. Others struggled to align their hulls on slopes that tilted their guns off target. When German armor responded, their rounds came fast and accurate, punching through weaker side armor or smashing into tracks and suspensions. One platoon of M3 Lees attempted to flank the German column from a ridge, only to discover the limits of their two-gun configuration. The hull-mounted 75mm gun couldn't elevate enough on uneven ground, and the turret gun lacked the punch needed at longer ranges. The Germans saw the vulnerability immediately. Within minutes, smoke poured from two of the Lees, and the remaining tank was forced to retreat under heavy fire. Still, not everything favored the Germans. As the afternoon wore on, pockets of American resistance adapted quickly. Artillery observers climbed to exposed outcrops to correct fire under near-constant threat, coordinating barrages that temporarily halted the German infantry. Engineers blew charges to slow the armored advance. Small groups of riflemen used the rocky terrain to ambush advancing patrols, showing a resilience that would become a hallmark of later U.S. operations in Europe. But the momentum was unmistakable. The pass was turning into a bottleneck, and the Americans were being compressed toward its deeper interior. Every hour the Germans advanced, the pressure increased, and the lines that were meant to hold began to stretch thin. By late afternoon, the valley was a haze of dust, smoke, and engine fumes. The sound of tank treads reverberated off the mountainsides, mixing with shouted orders and the sharp crack of rifle fire. In the fading light, the Americans could see the silhouettes of more German vehicles approaching from the west. The battle was no longer a test. It was a struggle to keep the line from breaking entirely. As evening approached, the situation inside Kasserine grew heavier, almost claustrophobic. The pass was supposed to serve as a defensive choke point, a natural shield where the Americans could slow any advance. Instead, it had become a trap of converging roads, scattered units, and vehicles trying to maneuver in terrain too tight for them. Supply trucks attempted to bring ammunition forward, only to meet retreating troops. Jeeps carrying wounded wove between columns of armor moving in the opposite direction. Every minute of confusion cost the defenders the cohesion they desperately needed. At two corps headquarters, the picture was no clearer. Reports came in bursts, fragmented, often contradictory, each giving a slightly different account of where the front line actually was. Maps were updated, erased, and redrawn. Commanders tried to form a coherent plan, but without accurate information, every decision felt like a guess. Should they commit reserves now, or hold them for the next German push? Should armor counterattack or fall back to a stronger defensive position deeper in the mountains? The answers depended on a battlefield no one could fully see. Meanwhile, German commanders operated with a flexibility that came from long practice. Tank platoons shifted direction rapidly, striking weak points and slipping away before American units could react. Mobile infantry followed close behind, securing ground almost as fast as the armor opened it. Their logistics were efficient, their battlefield awareness sharp. They knew what they wanted: keep the Americans off balance, keep them reacting, never allow them to regain initiative. Inside the pass, American artillery became the anchor holding the line together. Batteries positioned on higher ground fired until barrels glowed, adjusting aim based on hurried radio calls from forward observers. When the range was correct, the effect was immediate. German infantry were forced to scatter, and armored vehicles paused, unwilling to push blindly into the blast zones. But ammunition was running low, and some guns were beginning to overheat. The crews kept going anyway. American infantry, scattered in small groups across the ridges and gullies, fought with a mix of determination and frustration. They could hear German engines before they could see them, the sound echoing off the canyon walls in distorted patterns. Some positions were bypassed entirely as German units pushed through gaps, leaving American soldiers unsure whether they were still on the front line or already behind enemy activity. In the fading light, every shadow became a question mark. Late in the evening, a counterattack by elements of the 1st Armored Division attempted to restore order. Tanks rolled forward, trying to find the flanks of the German spearhead. But limited visibility, narrow terrain, and lack of real-time information turned the maneuver into a slow, grinding advance. At one point, two American tank companies nearly collided in the darkness, each believing the other was a German force. When they finally reached firing positions, the Germans had already shifted focus elsewhere. The psychological weight of the battle began to show. For many Americans, Kasserine was more than a fight. It was the first time they felt truly outmatched in tactics, organization, and battlefield experience. They were brave, they were willing, but they were young in the craft of war. And as the pressure increased, that youth showed. Just before midnight, German armor pressed through yet another gap on the southern edge of the pass. The breach wasn't catastrophic, not yet, but it signaled the turning point. If the Americans failed to stabilize the line, Kasserine would no longer be a defense. It would become a route of retreat. The valley lay in darkness, lit only by burning vehicles and the sparse flashes of artillery. And in that darkness, both sides understood that the next day would decide the fate of the pass, and perhaps the fate of the entire American campaign in Tunisia. Before dawn, the command tents of 2 corps were lit by dim lamps and the constant rustle of paper maps being unfolded, rotated, and pinned. The night had offered no relief. Reports flooding in revealed breaches along multiple sections of the line. Engineers were still trying to reinforce positions, but the Germans were moving too quickly, exploiting every weak seam. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, operating far behind the front in a deeply recessed command post, struggled to maintain coherent control. His orders, often transmitted through multiple layers, lost clarity as they moved forward. In a battle that demanded immediacy, delay became a silent enemy. American commanders closer to the front sensed the urgency more acutely. Colonel Alexander Stark, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, and other field officers pushed their units into whatever defensive configurations the terrain allowed. They understood what was at stake. If the Germans broke through entirely, the only route left would be a long, chaotic retreat through the mountains. They reorganized platoons under fire, redirected supply trucks by hand, and tried to build a usable front line from fragments of units that had been battered the previous day. Meanwhile, the Germans prepared another coordinated thrust. Their armor columns refueled quickly, their infantry reorganized with an efficiency developed through years of desert warfare. Rommel's message to his officers was clear: keep pushing, drive deeper, do not let the Americans recover. He believed a decisive victory here could destabilize the entire Allied presence in Tunisia. And for several hours, it looked like he might be right. At first light, the next German assault hit with precision. Panzer IVs advanced in staggered formation, firing as they moved. Self-propelled guns followed close behind, using elevation to target American positions that had limited cover. Mortars and machine guns filled every gap in the attack pattern. The desert floor shook with the impact of coordinated fire. American attempts at counter-maneuvering were brave but complicated by fragmented communications. Units tried to reposition armor and anti-tank guns, but the terrain forced them into narrow lanes that became predictable targets. A platoon of Shermans attempted to reinforce the southern line, only to be hit by German anti-tank fire that had been placed overnight to cover likely avenues of approach. Within moments, 2 tanks were disabled, and the others were forced to withdraw. Yet, even under this pressure, the Americans were adapting. They learned quickly, perhaps their greatest strength. Forward observers improved their timing and accuracy, bringing down artillery closer to German positions. Radio operators established temporary relay points to strengthen communication. Infantry units dug into more defensible ridges, creating overlapping lines of fire instead of isolated pockets. But every adaptation came with a cost. Ammunition runs became perilous as the routes behind the pass filled with smoke, debris, and scattered vehicles. Medic teams worked non-stop, moving wounded across open ground that was rarely quiet. And commanders knew they were running out of time. If reinforcements didn't arrive soon, the line would eventually crack beyond repair. In the mid-morning haze, another breach opened along the central axis of the pass. Not large, no more than a few hundred yards, but enough to threaten the integrity of the entire defensive network. The Germans sensed it immediately. Their armor pivoted toward the weak spot, preparing to punch through. The valley echoed with engines revving, the metallic snap of tracks shifting direction, and the rising tension of a decisive moment. The Americans braced. Units pulled back to secondary positions, others moved forward to fill the gap, creating a patchwork defense held together by grit and instinct. They knew the next hours could decide the battle. If the line failed here, Kasserine would fall, and the consequences would ripple far beyond a single valley. By early afternoon, the sound of battle inside Kasserine had taken on a different tone. The sharp, confident tempo of the German advance was still there, but it no longer carried the same relentless momentum. Their tanks were still pushing, their infantry still pressing, yet the rhythm had slowed, just slightly. And in war, a slight shift is often the first sign of a turning point. The Americans could feel it. Units that had been forced back earlier in the fight now held their new positions with steadier discipline. Field officers reorganized scattered platoons into more coherent lines. Ammunition, still far from plentiful, was being rationed more intelligently. Artillery batteries, which had been firing almost non-stop for more than a day, adjusted their barrages with tighter precision, hitting German staging areas and slowing preparation for new assaults. But the real change came with the arrival of reinforcements. Elements of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, began reaching the rear edges of the pass. Hardened by previous fighting in North Africa, these troops moved with practiced composure. They knew how to dig in properly, how to coordinate with armor, and how to read German tactics. Their presence alone steadied the atmosphere among exhausted units that had been fighting since the first shells landed. Alongside them came British units under General Kenneth Anderson, moving to reinforce flanks and seal off potential German breakout routes. The Allied command structure had been shaky at the start of the battle, but now, with pressure mounting, coordination began to improve. Not perfect, far from it, but good enough to matter. Still, the Germans weren't done. Rommel ordered one more concentrated push, hoping to break the Americans before the defensive line solidified completely. His armored spearheads swung toward the central sector of the pass, aiming to split the defenders in two. Panzer IVs advanced with infantry in close support, their engines growling through clouds of drifting smoke. But the terrain that had favored them so well earlier now began to work in the Americans' favor. With reinforced positions on the high ground, American machine gunners had cleaner fields of fire. Mortar teams coordinated more closely with forward observers. Anti-tank guns, hastily repositioned during the night, were now placed in stronger, concealed positions that allowed for flanking shots. When the German tanks emerged from the haze, they faced a wall of overlapping fire they hadn't encountered before. The 1st Panzer was hit on its right side, tracks snapping as the vehicle lurched to a halt. A second tank rolled forward to cover it, only to take a direct artillery strike that rocked it sideways. German infantry pushed on, trading fire with American riflemen dug into rocky ledges, but their momentum slowed with every yard gained. Then, for the first time in the battle, American armor counterattacked with something resembling coordination. Sherman tanks supported by M10 tank destroyers advanced in a controlled line, firing from hull-down positions where only their turrets were exposed. Their rounds weren't always decisive, but they were accurate enough to force the Germans to maneuver, and maneuvering meant slowing down, exposing flanks, and giving American artillery more time to work. As the afternoon burned into evening, the Germans began to feel the strain of the desert. Fuel trucks struggled to reach the front under harassing fire. Ammunition stocks dipped lower. Their infantry, pushing through relentless American resistance, began to tire. Rommel recognized the signs, the moment when offensive firepower risks turning into overextension. At Kasserine, the Americans hadn't won. Not yet. But they had done something just as important. They had stopped losing at the enemy's pace. For the first time since the battle began, the valley wasn't just collapsing inward. It was resisting. The next morning brought no silence, only a quieter kind of violence, the kind that comes when both sides know the momentum has shifted but refuse to admit it. The Germans prepared for another push, but their movements lacked the crisp urgency of the earlier days. Tanks rolled forward, though not in smooth waves. Their spacing was irregular, their advance methodical rather than aggressive. Fuel shortages had begun to bite hard. More importantly, the element of relentless initiative, Rommel's trademark, was fading. American observers noticed the change immediately. The dust plumes were smaller. The intervals between German probe attacks grew longer. Their artillery, once precise and relentless, fired in shorter bursts, as if rationing shells. For the first time, the Americans weren't just reacting to the German tempo, they were reading it, anticipating it, and preparing to exploit it. Behind the newly stabilized defensive line, the 1st Infantry Division and supporting British units worked quickly. They strengthened foxholes, repositioned heavy weapons, and set up coordinated fire patterns that allowed overlapping coverage across the central corridor of the pass. Tank destroyer crews were assigned kill zones with clear arcs of fire. Artillery batteries recalibrated their ranges based on more reliable spotting. What began the week as a disjointed defensive network was now starting to resemble a coherent, disciplined line. The Germans, still determined to break through, launched a midday assault aimed at the eastern ridges. Panzer grenadiers advanced under cover of smoke, attempting to dislodge American infantry from positions that anchored the entire sector. But the Americans held with grim determination. Machine gun nests that had been poorly placed earlier in the battle were now positioned with full visibility of the valley below. Mortar fire landed with improved accuracy, striking German assembly points before they could fully form. American armor also played a new role. Instead of charging blindly into German guns, tank commanders used the terrain more wisely. Shermans emerged from behind rock formations, fired a few well-placed rounds, then backed out before German gunners could zero in. The hit-and-fade approach wasn't elegant, but it disrupted German plans and forced their armor to fight on American terms. Rommel realized the truth before many of his subordinates. His force had reached its operational limit. Every yard gained was costing fuel and ammunition he couldn't easily replace. Every attack pushed his units deeper into a narrowing valley, further from supply lines and closer to the converging fire of reorganized American defenders. Even victory would leave his force dangerously exposed. By late afternoon, the German offensive had slowed to a crawl. Their infantry, still disciplined but increasingly exhausted, found themselves pinned more often than they advanced. Their tanks hesitated at ridgelines, wary of anti-tank guns hidden in new positions. What had begun as a confident thrust now felt like a fight against an enemy who refused to break. And then came the moment that marked the shift from defense to offense. American artillery, coordinated, precise, and communicated through a far more stable radio network, launched a rolling barrage across the German staging areas. It wasn't overwhelming in size, but it hit exactly where it needed to: crossroads, choke points, and supply routes that had kept the German attack alive. The barrage forced German armor to scatter, delayed resupply, and, for the first time, pushed them into reactive posture. The valley trembled under the weight of the shells. Dust rose in pillars. German units paused, reorganized, hesitated. In that hesitation, the Americans saw opportunity. They weren't ready for a full counterattack yet. That would come later, but the psychological tide had turned. The fear of collapse had faded. The sense of inevitability had lifted. And across Kasserine Pass, soldiers who had spent days fighting desperately now felt something new: confidence. The Germans had hit their limit. The Americans had not. The final phase of the battle began with something deceptively simple: a pause. Not a retreat, not a collapse, just a pause in the German advance long enough for American and British commanders to recognize what it meant. The momentum was no longer on Rommel's side. His forces were stretched thin, their supply lines strained, their tanks running low on fuel, and their infantry worn down by days of fighting in unfavorable terrain. The offensive had reached saturation. For II Corps, this moment was the opening they desperately needed. Reinforcements were now fully integrated into the defensive layout. Communications, once chaotic, had settled into a workable rhythm. American officers had a clearer understanding of German positions, their attack patterns, and the vulnerabilities created by their own overextension. What the Americans lacked in polish, they now made up for in adaptability. The counterattack didn't begin with a dramatic surge. It started with carefully timed artillery fire, walked forward across the valley in a slow, deliberate pattern that forced the Germans to abandon key vantage points. Then, infantry units moved, not in a reckless charge, but in controlled advances supported by overlapping fire and forward observers. They were no longer fighting as isolated fragments, they were acting as a coordinated force. Shermans and M10 tank destroyers emerged next, working alongside infantry rather than racing ahead of them. They advanced behind ridges and low hills, using defilade positions to protect their hulls. Their gunners fired when they had clear shots, not simply when targets appeared. Every step forward showed a kind of discipline the Americans had lacked only days before. German resistance remained sharp. Their rearguard was experienced, composed of soldiers who knew how to delay an enemy without becoming trapped. They set ambushes, laid mines, and conducted controlled withdrawals. But the spark of initiative that had carried them into the pass was gone. Rommel, seeing the situation deteriorate, ordered a general pullback to avoid losing more men and armor in terrain that no longer favored them. The withdrawal wasn't a rout, It was a grudging acknowledgment that the Americans had held. The passes of Kasserine were no longer gateways to Allied collapse. They had become dead ends for German ambitions. As the firing tapered off, two corps advanced cautiously through the battered valley. The ground was scarred with burned-out vehicles, shattered trenches, and the debris of units that had been caught between competing lines of fire. Medics moved alongside riflemen, searching for wounded. Engineers marked safe paths through mined areas and began clearing routes for supply convoys. For the soldiers who had survived the initial shock, the landscape felt both familiar and foreign. The same place, but not the same army. In the days that followed, the true impact of Kasserine became clear. The U.S. Army initiated sweeping changes. Command structures were reorganized, tactics refined, training intensified, and leaders replaced where necessary. Two corps received new commanders, new doctrines, and a renewed focus on combined arms warfare. What had been exposed at Kasserine was not weakness alone, it was potential. The Americans had endured the hardest kind of lesson, one delivered under fire, in a place where mistakes carried a price written in lives. And that lesson reshaped them. Months later, at battles like El Getter, Jela, and Normandy, the transformation would be unmistakable. The United States would fight with a confidence earned the hard way, through failure, adaptation, and the will to recover. Kasserine did not define the American army. It refined it. As the wind returned to the valley and the smoke drifted into the mountains, one truth lingered. The battle had been an error, a shock, and a near disaster, but it had also been the lesson that marked the beginning of a very different war for the United States.